How did Montgomery integrate fires into the plan for Operation Lightfoot to create a battle-winning capability? We look at the principles for the employment of artillery at 2nd El Alamein.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 91 of the Principles of War podcast. This episode is the last episode in our 2nd El Alamein series, and it will conclude our look at the employment of artillery during 2nd El Alamein. Looking at the German artillery after-action review, the actions of the artillery chief, Krauss, have been debated for a long time. He wrote a memo before the battle highlighting that the intelligence brief was that they were outnumbered as far as 8th Army guns were. However, he had planned to take an aggressive stance. He laid down his priorities that when the enemy attacks, it would be preceded by heavy artillery fire, and he would have an immediate retaliatory action. The batteries were to keep in touch with the 33rd Armoured Survey Troop for details of their latest reconnaissance, and that the targets would be recorded by survey units were to be added to the enemy hostile battery lists, also as along with the ones that have been pinpointed by the OPs. That done, he said, allocation of targets can be made in a manner that counterfire can begin immediately the code word is given, thus supporting our infantry as soon as the enemy barrage starts. As we've seen, this never happened. We don't know whether Krauss changed his mind or whether he'd been overruled by General Stumm, who was acting for Rommel in his absence, remembering that Rommel had gone to Germany for medical attention, or if it had come from General von Thoma, who was the Panzer Army Africa commander. Kirkman's already noted that the Panzer Army Africa artillery was generally ineffective in the counter-battery role. They were much more reactive to the pressure from 30th Corps and, in particular, the salient that was created by the 9th Division, especially as they made their move towards the coast road. This meant that it was the infantry and the anti-tank gunners who received most of the attention of the Axis gunners. It's important to remember that they were quite effective. So it is estimated that the 24th Brigade, as they were fighting in the Saucer, suffered over 500 casualties from German artillery. The key task for the Axis artillery on the first morning of the attack was to deny the 8th Army the ability to clear lanes through the minefield. That was the most important task. Locations for defensive fires had been prearranged. However, what they hadn't done is correctly appreciated the time and distance that the 8th Army sappers would cover. The engineers of the Australian, New Zealand and South African divisions made much better time than had been anticipated, and this was because of techniques that they developed. They knew that they had a very deep minefield that they needed to clear, so a lot of work had been done to enable them to clear it as quickly as possible. Now, this meant that when those defensive fires came down, they had made better progress than anticipated, they were further west than anticipated, and they missed most of the defensive fires that the Axis were able to bring down. The Desert Air Force also played a significant role in decreasing the ability of the Axis artillery to react appropriately. The tactical bombing and strafing, as well as the communications jamming, significantly hampered Axis artillery command and control. The staff of 15th Panzer attributed the root cause to their lack of effectiveness to the late delivery of reports from the front, a lack of planned action against 8th Army artillery owing to low stocks of ammunition, losses to men and equipment because of the use of Allied predicted fire, the uselessness of the 76.2 self-propelled gun due to its low mobility and inadequate range. In their first action, 8 were knocked out before they could even fire. They also mentioned the inadequately engineered mounting for the 150mm self-propelled heavy howitzer, and the superiority of the British guns in numbers and range, which caused heavy losses. Now, this is in spite of the fact that the 8th Army had no heavy guns and were outnumbered as far as medium guns went as well. They also mentioned the not insignificant loss of the 88mm guns. This was a high-value target for the Allies. It was critical for the Germans to be able to counter any armoured thrusts, and it was a very powerful weapon. However, there were a couple of issues with it. It was very easy to see in aerial photos. It's got quite a high profile, so there was often a long shadow. When discovered, Divisional Artillery Headquarters would make sure that they received the full attention, usually of the medium guns, because they were such an important target. This leads on to one of the other lessons of El Alamein. 88s in the open or enemy entrenchments had led to a high demand for timed fuses, which were used to create a high explosive airburst effect. It was the weapon of choice against troops in slit trenches and under light cover, and also against the anti-tank guns. Following the battle, opinion within the 8th Army was emphatically in favour of the use of airburst HE as a lethal weapon, and a request was made for 15% of all field and medium artillery ammunition to be time-fused. From an Australian point of view, the official history states that the biggest contribution to the division's success in defending the ground that it captured was from the artillery. This view was shared by Montgomery. He wrote on the 1st of November to General Brooke, who was the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in London. The artillery fire has been superb, and such a concentrated use of artillery has not been seen before in North Africa. We could not have done what we have done without the artillery, and that arm has been wonderful. A great trouble has been that most of the Commander's Royal Artillery knew very little about how to handle this artillery when concentrated. The policy of dispersion and of brigade groups has been the rule, and they have not been properly taught. These are some of the issues that Auchinleck had already identified and had been working towards fixing. But without the doctrine, without the training, and without the command relationships, it's very difficult to enable concentration of fire at the divisional and corps level. Artillery command and control worked so well in 9th Division because of the fact that Ramsay and his staff officers had experience in World War I, because this was the employment of artillery, not quite on a World War I scale, but definitely bigger than anything that had been attempted up until this point, and definitely along the World War I doctrinal approach. Now let's look at the battle from the characteristics for the employment of artillery. So we're looking at flexibility, versatility, responsiveness, and reach. Flexibility is the ability to switch quickly from one task to another, or to be capable of achieving a range of tasks during a mission. Artillery achieves flexibility through the capacity to mass indirect fire support and to shift that fire between targets quickly and without the need to redeploy. It also achieves flexibility through the diversity of ammunition natures. The doctrine finishes up the definition with the ability of artillery to shift its fire in response to changes in the tactical situation provides a land commander with inherent flexibility. This is exactly what Montgomery did. When you think about it, he was able to attrit the Panzer Army Africa, degrade their ability to generate combat power. As the battle unfolded, he needed to be responsive to the changes, the difficulty that the armour was having, and the casualties that some of the other divisions were sustaining. He was able to get Rommel to impale his strategic reserve on the horns of 9th Division, and let's be realistic, it was only one brigade of 9th Division that was decisively engaged at any one time. How was he able to do that? Rather than feeding in troops, rather than feeding in more armour, he was able to feed in more guns. At its peak, 9th Division was supported by most of the guns within 30th Corps and the guns that were in support of 1st Armoured. That's in 10th Corps. That was because of the importance that Montgomery placed on the battle that 9th Division was fighting. We see flexibility in some of the tasks that were assigned to the artillery, so I'm thinking of the anti-aircraft guns firing over the heads of the troops as they advanced. Now, that may not seem like a big thing to some people, but for anyone who's been trying to navigate at night, let alone trying to navigate within very narrow lanes that have been cleared in a minefield, that's really important. The role that the artillery played in degrading the density of the mines in the Devil's Garden. The anti-tank role, a very, very important role when you're up against someone like Rommel, whose standard operating procedure was to mass armour and then roll his enemy. the anti-tank gunners with their 6-pounders were able to deny the Panzer Division's ability to close with the infantry. There's also the role of the anti-aircraft gunners. Now, he was very keen to deny observation of what was going on in the north because of his huge deception plan. As a consequence of this, he weighted his effort with anti-aircraft guns up in the north to try and minimise the risk that the ruse would be spotted for Op Bertram. The next characteristic is versatility, and that really comes down to the range of artillery tasks that can be carried out. We see this versatility in the 15 minutes of counter-battery fires that are conducted right before the commencement of Operation Lightfoot. The artillery then transmissions with just 5 minutes worth of pause from counter-battery fires into supporting the infantry as they advance. We also see that in the way that the field artillery was used in the anti-armoured role. Now, we're not thinking about direct fire here because that's not a great way of employing it, and it's actually quite dangerous for the gun batteries. We're thinking about the mechanical time fuses, the airburst, the HE airburst. This forces the tanks to close up. The commander is going to close his hatch. They're going to be trying to observe the battlefield through little tiny periscopes. It significantly degrades their situational awareness. You're aiming to knock off antennas to decrease their ability to communicate. There's going to be dust, which is going to create added confusion. And often this was enough to convince the tankers to withdraw. Next characteristic, responsiveness. All-weather, day-night fires in support of the supported arm. Incredibly important. Not only that, but we see an incredible amount of work being conducted at the battery command post level so that the fires are incredibly timely. The best example of that, 14th Battery from 2nd 7th. We think about the drills that would have needed to gone into that because all they would have got would have been a coordinate of where the fires were required. It may have been a predetermined location, which would have enabled them to determine the charge, bearing and elevation before the call for fire came in. But they would have had many of those predetermined locations. So an incredible amount of staff work on locations which they may or may not fire on. All of that done so that they can get the firing data out to the guns as quickly as possible so that they can get rounds downrange in support of the infantry when they needed that. Reach. Last characteristic, the range of artillery systems and the access to assets of some coalition partners adds depth to the battlefield. We saw this in 8th Army. We saw the field guns and the medium guns being used to surround the Axis in that northern salient. This is an excellent example because not only do we have Australian guns in support of the 9th Division, but we also have New Zealand, South African, and British guns. Now, interestingly enough, not only do we go to coalition, but we also go to joint because we see the Air Force stepping into that capability of providing the long-range fires. This was because there wasn't any heavy artillery within 8th Army. When we're looking to generate an effect, it doesn't have to be necessarily the guns. We've also got the Air Force who are able to assist. And if the Navy had been in attendance, there could have been naval gunfire support as well. Montgomery wrote his letter on the 1st of November, and it was only on the 8th of November, just 1 week later, that the Navy was in support, providing a prodigious amount of naval gunfire support to the Torch landings much further east. Now we'll finish up with looking at the principles of employment for artillery, being cooperation, concentration of fire, economy of effort, and sustainment. How was artillery at 2nd Alamein employed, and did they deviate from any of these principles? Let's have a look. Within the field artillery, effective fire support involves knowing when, where, and what type of fire is required, and this is achieved by planning, liaison, standard terminology, and the status of command. This is as it is in the doctrine. Brigadier Sidney Kirkman is brought in by Montgomery to completely reorganise the command and control of artillery to enable the concentration of fire, which is then our next principle. Not only was the C2 reworked, but also the doctrine and the drills, because remember, we are working our way up to the ability to conduct a stonk, a standard concentration, with 72 guns. That's a divisional artillery mission. 72 guns. The Royal Artillery had 8 gun batteries at this time, so a regimental mission was 24 guns. We're talking 72, so that's 3 regiments all firing at the same place at the same time. The command and control enables the cooperation which generates the effect, which is the concentration of fire. Surveillance and target acquisition. This is the counter-battery office and the artillery intelligence function. The general military intelligence function is predominantly interested in the enemy location, strength, condition, and intentions. Artillery intelligence wants to know all of that as well so that the fire plan that will support the maneuver commander can be properly integrated so that the effects will create the maximum advantage for friendly troops as they're conducting their maneuver. The counter-battery office is very interested in the enemy artillery, including mortars, because remember the golden rule, do unto others before they can do unto you. At 2nd Alamein, that role fell to the flash spotters and the sound ranging troops. They were operating from locations surveyed in by the survey troops so that they're all on a common grid, the theatre grid. That means they very precisely know their location, and when they get a bearing to a hostile battery, they can use some fancy trigonometry to very precisely locate that hostile battery. That information then is used to fight the counter-battery battle. But in this battle, we see much wider cooperation. The Desert Air Force conducts the photo reconnaissance role, allowing photos which are then gridded to provide a very accurate location of hostile batteries. Remember, some of those batteries may be tasked with not firing, so that when the artillery battle is joined, batteries that don't fire are much less likely to end up on the hostile battery list, which enables them to be ready to conduct the counter-battery battle when the battle commences. In 8th Army, at this time, we see two mechanisms of cooperation between the infantry and the artillery before the battle commences. Firstly, patrol reports, where infantry have been able to spot a battery that may or may not be on the hostile battery list. We also see infantry patrols being sent out in an effort to draw hostile battery fire. The flash spotters and the sound rangers were already queued on to the likelihood of firing. They were ready to locate those batteries. And so the infantry were used to draw out those resources so that they would be known at the start of the battle and could that way be neutralised. Next, we've got the ground-based air defence, our anti-aircraft gunners. They were doing two important roles. Firstly, there was the vital asset protection, protecting things like headquarters and airfields. But in concert with the Desert Air Force, they were working to attrit the Luftwaffe. The casualties that were inflicted enabled them to deny the Luftwaffe the ability to manoeuvre over the Allied lines. And this was really important, not because of the casualties that they could have caused, but the information that they may have gained. Op Bertram, the deception plan in support of Op Lightfoot, had a dominant narrative that Montgomery was going to attack in the south. What he was actually trying to do was to hide 2 corps worth of troops up on towards the coast. As we've seen in our episodes about Op Bertram and the deception plan, this was quite successful. Rommel wasn't able to concentrate his forces to mount an effective counterattack. He wasn't sure where the main attack was going to come, so his main reserves, his main counterattack elements, the panzer divisions, were split, one in the north and one in the south. Part of the task of denying him that situational understanding came down to the anti-aircraft gunners as they protected those forming up areas. In our doctrine today, we don't talk about the role of the anti-tank gunners when it comes to the employment of artillery because they're with the infantry now. But I think it's really important just to mention the role that they played because it was critical as a part of the defence of the locations, particularly as 9th Division started to draw in those critical reserves that Rommel had, those panzer divisions. The role of anti-tank gunner/infantry very much blurred in this battle because the 6-pounders were with the gunners and the infantry were given the 2-pounders. The 2-pounder, an older gun, less stopping power, however, still, when craftily sighted on a flank of an attack, was able to inflict damage to the Deutsche Afrikakorps tanks as they were coming on. A role not for the faint-hearted because it was often done at quite close range. Casualties amongst the anti-tank gunners were quite heavy, but they could have been worse. At this point of the war, German doctrine had started to believe their own propaganda in the supremacy of the tank in the attack. The role that the infantry would play had been de-emphasised. This meant that there was less infantry supporting the tanks as they were attacking. The infantry's primary target would have been the anti-tank gunners. Would it have made a difference if there were more infantry supporting the Axis tanks as they advanced? I don't think so. And that's because the defenders were well supported with the field artillery conducting those stonk missions. This means that we're getting a lot of rounds on the target as they're moving. They're using variable time fuses. That means there's a lot of shrapnel in the air. VT, not particularly effective against armour, but it will do a couple of things. It will knock off the aerials, it will force them to close down so that they're going to be now conducting their attack looking through those tiny periscopes, greatly degrades their situational understanding of the battlefield, and this is why they'll often miss anti-tank guns out in the open. But critically, the role of that stonk is to dislocate any supporting infantry from the armour. We're going to try and break down the combined arms equation so that it is armour alone, and which can then be defeated by the anti-tank gunners. And that, in my mind, is a really good example of the cooperation that is capable when you look at the combined arms capabilities that artillery adds to the modern battlefield. The second principle is concentration of fire. We've talked about that because you can't generate concentration of fire without the command and control arrangements, without the doctrine to be able to enable large numbers of guns to be able to fire at that one target. And we talked about time on target, really critical because most of the casualties occur in the first 60 seconds. It's that time that people are out of their pits, they're not dug in, they're open, they're exposed to the effects of artillery. After that, the effects diminish significantly. It's also why artillery in the defense is so effective, because you are, by definition, firing at an enemy who is maneuvering. They are not in a protected position. The next principle, doctrinally, is economy of effort is achieved by overlaying multiple fire units to achieve redundancy, maintaining a reserve of ammunition to engage targets of opportunity, coordinating artillery fire with that of other weapons to achieve a greater weight of fire, and having logistic arrangements that support the application of fire. Economy of effort implemented in one area allows the greater concentration of force at decisive points at critical times. Linking sensors to shooters enhances the economy of effort by releasing reconnaissance and surveillance assets for other tasking. Economy of effort is important in GBAD resources, which are limited in number and not able to protect every vulnerable point or asset. Economy of effort is used by Montgomery in the way that he weights his main effort, which is the Northern Coastal Road advance with 30th Corps. That has more artillery supporting it than 13th Corps down in the south. And that's because the role of 13th Corps is only to conduct a feint. It is going to attack, it is going to draw the attention of Panzer Army Africa and delay the point at which they realise that the main effort of 8th Army is the Coast Road. It's important to remember that economy of effort is one of the general principles of war as well, and I think there's a really interesting example of this here. Maharbal, who was the Numidian cavalry commander under Hannibal, said, "Assuredly, no man has been blessed with all God's gifts. You, Hannibal, know how to gain a victory, but you do not know how to use it." For Montgomery, his job was to sequence battles in order to achieve the operational end state. He wasn't going to make the same mistake that Hannibal made. Operation Lightfoot didn't get off to a good start, but Montgomery became aware that Panzer Army Africa was fixated on the role that the 9th Division was having as they threatened the Coast Road, and Rommel saw that one of his divisions may be cut off. Montgomery gave 9th Division a series of terrain objectives, none of which they actually achieved, but their goal was to have the Deutsche Afrika Korps culminate, to be finished as a fighting force and unable to mount an effective defence. He started withdrawing other units from the line so that they could rest and refit and be ready to conduct the breakthrough and then the pursuit of the Deutsche Afrika Korps. Montgomery allocates the minimum amount of resources for this phase of the operation. The main effort, culmination of the Deutsche Afrika Korps, That's 9th Division's job. He weights his main effort with all of the artillery that he has available, and it is a not inconsiderable amount. Remember, this is the apogee of Australian artillery in the Second World War. Brigadier Ramsay, the Commander Royal Artillery for 9th Division, will command more artillery than any other Australian officer at any other point in the Second World War. Freiberg, the commander of the 2nd New Zealand Division, is given the resources that he will need to achieve the breakthrough. Once the Deutsche Afrika Korps has committed itself to those counterattacks that it would make against 9th Division in order to protect that coast road. And in doing so, culminate and be forced to withdraw. They're going to face fresh divisions, freshly supplied, ready to conduct the pursuit. The 2nd of November sees Montgomery commence Op Supercharge, the breakthrough and the pursuit. Little does Rommel know that on the 8th of November, the torch landings will commence. Montgomery's 8th Army will become the hammer to Eisenhower's 1st Army's anvil. There will still be 6 months of hard fighting before the end of Axis resistance in North Africa. That comes in May, but at that point there are 230,000 German and Italian prisoners of war. Montgomery was focused on the operational end state, the complete cessation of hostilities in North Africa. And all of his planning and sequencing went towards ensuring that that would occur. This is in contrast to Rommel, who did not see the strategic value of North Africa, or the limited strategic value of North Africa. Last principle for the employment of artillery is sustainment. Sustainment is critical to the uninterrupted provision of fire support. It involves the supply of ammunition, the maintenance of systems, and the protection of logistic and technical support assets. In high-intensity conflict, the supply of artillery ammunition is one of the largest single components in the resupply chain. Up to 70% of Army's lift capability may be required to support artillery ammunition. The nature of modern artillery systems has created an increased requirement for technical maintenance and information technology support. This is an excellent example of the strengths versus weaknesses component in the way that Montgomery structured 2nd Alamein, because sustainment was a strong strength of 8th Army. Going back to the time of Auchinleck, a significant build-up in not only material but also ammunition and fuel was occurring so that there would be the resources to enable them to defeat the Panzer Army Africa. In 30th Corps, each gun fired 1,300 rounds during Op Lightfoot. The 9th Division guns fired 50% more than the Corps average, and the 2nd 7th Field Regiment fired 65,594 rounds in 13 days. That's over 200 rounds per gun per day for 13 days straight. That's an incredible amount of ammunition usage. It highlights the industrial strength of the Allies, the ability to produce that much ammunition, the ability to transport that ammunition to the front, and then, critically, once again we go back to Op Bertram, where the stockpiling of that ammunition was hidden from prying eyes. So not only were the gun positions well stocked with ammunition, but subsequent gun positions that they would occupy after they'd fired their fire plan was also stocked with ammunition dumps. This enabled that high rate of fire to be maintained for the 13 days of the battle. Once again, compare and contrast with Rommel. Inadequate artillery stocks apart from, tragically, 25-pounder ammunition, which he had captured in almost unlimited quantities, and more so gasoline, just not enough fuel to be able to move the Panzer Army Africa around. So there you have it, the employment of artillery at 2nd Alamein, a use of artillery that had a decisive effect on the battle. And one which I'm certain if Montgomery hadn't made those C2 changes and been able to mass fires in the quantity that he was able to, 2nd Alamein would not have been the success that it was. That in no way diminishes the hard fighting done particularly by the infantry. It was a desperate battle against an incredibly well-trained, experienced, high-morale enemy. As we leave 2nd Alamein, I think it's interesting to ponder how artillery was employed then and think about how it is likely to be employed on future battlefields. To what degree will we need to see the concentration across rockets and medium guns? How will sustainment be achieved? Will we be able to build up the war stocks that are required to be able to achieve those concentrations? How will ISR be conducted, and how will that feed into the equivalent of the counter-battery office? How will counter-battery doctrine be developed? And lastly, I think a really interesting point is how would the anti-tank weapons be employed moving forward? We're seeing some very interesting drone and anti-tank missile developments in Ukraine. What are they going to look for like future employment? Particularly interesting when you look at 2nd Alamein, Montgomery hesitant to use his armour because of their lack of training, doctrine and aggressive command, and so he weighted his main effort with infantry supported with inordinate amount of artillery. However, they faced a foe that was strong in armour, and that's where we see the employment of the 6 and 2 pounders. The 2 pounders, once they'd been replaced in the anti-tank regiments, they went to the infantry battalions so that 8th Army could ensure that there would be as much anti-tank threat out there as possible. What does that mean for future ORBATs when we look at the use of anti-tank weapons? I'll leave you with those questions to ponder. If you've gotten anything out of this, please like or share it on any of the social medias that you've got. Let us know how you're incorporating it into your PME programs. I'm always interested to hear that.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by Jane Zeeling. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.